Reconsider Christ podcast provides real-life examples on how Christ works to interact with our lives. Our guests paint on the canvas of life their stories of joy, heartache, struggle, and victory. You will learn more about the true nature of Christ, for it is time to reconsider Christ. Cancer punctuates Patricia Asp's amazing career. The lessons from dealing with several family members suffering from cancer challenged Pat to adapt her leadership style. Caring for her father as cancer slowly took his life, Pat began to understand the importance of empathy. When Pat's husband announced the discovery of his cancer, Pat shifted quickly back to caring. In the midst of her husband's successful fight with cancer, Pat realized her type A workaholism had taken precious family time away. She immediately adjusted her boundaries of work and family. Pat's successful career includes executive positions in hospital management and service master. Now Pat helps companies build great cultures through Aspire Consulting. Well, hello, Pat.
Hello, Gene.
It's so good to be with you today. I've been looking forward to an opportunity to talk about what Christ has done in your life throughout your career. And thank you for your time.
And thank you, Gene, for letting me participate.
Where did you see that switch over from it's what we do to it's the relationship, it's growing towards Christ? Yeah.
I think it was more of an iteration.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was more of an evolve versus an event.
Right.
I think I realized when there's major events in my life that I wasn't in control.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a career like I did, and you think, I got this done, I got that done, I got this done. And you kind of think you control it.
Right.
And it's in times of life that you're thrown a curveball,
mm-hmm.
that you realize you're not in control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think those are probably the most difficult times because my career was solving problems.
Right. Yes.
And there are some things I couldn't solve.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great illustration and example because as in operations, as you were teaching Six Sigma later in your career, running a hospital, running a business unit, going to corporate, and we'll talk about all that more even later, you were solving problems and you were being rewarded for that ability to solve problems. What was one of the early examples where you realized, maybe I'm not in control of everything?
I think that most emotionally charged the first time, excuse me, was when my father was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's. He was only 62 years old.
Yeah.
And had the body of a 22-year-old, as they said at Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
Tended to be environmental at the time,
Mm-hmm.
They used DDT and stuff.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I felt like someone had sawed me in half.
Yeah.
And I remember just kneeling in the chapel that day when we were over at Mayo Clinic. Mm-hmm. And I went with him because my brother, husband, mom had to stay, take care of the farm, right? And
yeah.
And it was out of my control. And there wasn't, you bring them to the best place in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be treated. But even then, you realize it's not in my control.
Yeah.
And then it happened again when my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And when all of a sudden he had to have emergency open heart surgery because of the chemo that was used. And you just realize that, your best opportunity to live life to its fullest is really in communion
mm-hmm.
with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that and surrender to the fact that you're not in control.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the example of your father. Obviously, as a daughter, he was so precious to you because of the outstanding picture that he painted for you of a father and a man and someone following after Christ. So, just all the wonderful things that you would want to have in your heart. And you're in that chapel and you're talking to God and Christ and going, this is not what I want. We need to get this fixed. Is it anger? Was it grief? What was it early on there?
Pleading.
Mm-hmm.
Just pleading.
Yeah.
Not anger, just pleading.
Mm-hmm.
And, wasn't it as advanced as this was like almost 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
It wasn't as advanced.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that, we all have a definition of miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
Our case, of course, I wanted him cured and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to just let the Lord describe the miracles, right?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? Tell me more about that.
Well, I can remember it was at the end state of my dad's life. He went into remission 7 years, it remanifested. So 7 years later, the only thing we could do is get access to something experimental, which
Mm-hmm.
was interferon at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And it didn't look good.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't look good. And my sister, I have an older sister who is just such a faithful person, was praying for a miracle. And we knew, the doctors had told us, we knew exactly, we probably had days left.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember saying to my sister, maybe instead of praying for a miracle, we just need to pray for Dad.
Mm-hmm.
Just for Dad.
And what's the difference?
Because our definition was that he would get better. Mm-hmm. And live a full life. God's definition was that he would send us a physical sign that my father was okay. And we walked back in the room after lunch, and there was this beautiful smell. It was like we walked into a flower garden, mm-hmm. full of roses. And I thought, did they clean the room? What'd they do, So I went up to kiss my dad, let him know we were in the room back, and I thought, what the heck? And my brother and my mom kissed him, It was coming from my phone. Huh. It was coming from my phone. And they couldn't get the clinical signs after that, right? Mm-hmm. And his lungs were still working, yeah. But he had passed.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget the pastor saying, he said, you've been given a gift.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a change in light in the room. Sometimes it's a smell of incense. Sometimes it's a smell of flowers. But this wasn't your imagination.
Yeah. That's amazing. And so how did you make that transition to say, if I paraphrase, not my will, but yours, help us understand your will here. What caused that transition for you to have that trust?
I think for me, it was seeing my dad suffer, mm-hmm. and realizing that just hold on would be just for him to suffer. He had always said, give me 10 years less. Don't hook me up to a machine.
Mhm.
That was his philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And I think when you see a person suffer,
Mhm.
when you see a person suffer, you realize that there are better things
Mhm. Right.
than staying here and suffering.
Mhm. So 20 years later, you're at Service Master by then. Your career is just expanding unbelievably. I guess probably at this point, you were in the pre-acquisition mode right before Service Master bought the companies with which you were working. And your husband comes in one day and says, it looks like, something's wrong and it's going to be cancer. So here you are now. How did you respond differently than from the first time you heard the news from your father? And what was the next step then in learning about how God was going to deal with you and your family?
I think it was very easy for me to turn on a dime. When
Mhm.
he was diagnosed, I was leading Six Sigma.
Oh,
Voice of
okay.
the customer, voice of the
Yes.
employee, my
Mhm.
calendar. I was flying back and forth between Chicago and Memphis.
Uh-huh.
And all of a sudden, nothing else mattered but Glenn.
Mhm.
And the company was phenomenal. They made available, we had a private jet, stuff like that, zipping back
Mhm.
and forth. I never did miss any of his chemo or doctor's appointments. And I was there and he laughed at me because, we were in the chemo room and he said, Pat, look down here. Everybody's all hooked up and
Right.
whatever.
Right.
He said, what's wrong with this picture? I said, none of those people have anybody with them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
He said, yeah. He said, I think I'll be just fine.
Can I have some privacy, Pat?
I'll be fine,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it was so clear to me. It was so clear. And it reminded me that, don't wait for an emergency to be present. Try being a present on a regular basis rather than waiting for someone either be dying or getting diagnosed with cancer or whatever. Just be present.
That's fascinating. I really like that. So now I got another question based on that, and I don't mean this to be so. Just a natural question from what you just said. So then, did you feel you were a little out of balance before his diagnosis?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Tell us about that.
I've been out of balance, I think, my whole life, Gene.
Oh, great.
I've stayed. See, that's why now, when people say, like, why don't you do this? Like, no, it's not that company. It's not anything. It's me.
Right. Right.
And I have to be very intentional about balance.
Uh-huh.
Extremely intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires of me, not my job, not my title, not the company you're turning around, not any of that. It's me. And so I know myself well enough that I have to be intentional about creating balance in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so this is interesting. If I were to summarize what cancer up to this point has meant in your life, with your father, it was a reminder of the importance of people that he had taught you, and there's an inclusivity that becomes a part of your management and leadership. You're out of balance, as most type A leaders are, and it's easy to just be absorbed in work. Your husband's cancer I've got this situation. I'm interpreting just a little here. I've got this situation. I'll be with him. There's a jet. I bet you looked at some spreadsheets while you were with them. And
Well, I was usually back on a plane. Once I knew he wasn't going to have a reaction, that was my main concern.
yeah.
And he wasn't going to be violently sick after the chemo. I was back on the plane.
Yes.
And that was the way I just had to be absolutely sure that in my mind, that he was okay. He knew he was okay.
Right. So when did you?
That may have been,
Yeah. When did you realize that was the message for you? That realign, get back to your priority of family. Was it on the plane back and forth, or what woke you up?
I think what I realized with Glenn going through it, that there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. There's no guarantee for tomorrow. There's no guarantee. I think I had heard one time, what if the only thing that was in your life tomorrow is what you thank God for today?
So at that point, you were starting your career, roughly, if I kind of put the math together, and, starting to excel. How did that change your perspective of day-to-day work in your career at that point?
Well, my mom had always given me the example, and my mom and dad all were welcome in our home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they truly lived out Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
All people are created in the image and likeness of God, and they have inherent value and worth, are to be treated with dignity and respect, right? And so it was just that reminder that, I will not be in the presence of anything more holy other than the Blessed Sacrament itself than being with another human being. It's a great C.S. Lewis quote from The Weight of Glory. And that it was people that I was leading and hiring and firing and disciplining and all that other stuff in my life.
Yes.
And so it just, I think, reminded me of the significant weight of leadership and our responsibility that, we're paid to make the tough decisions and to get results, but we can do it with love. We can always do it with love, no matter what we're doing. And as bad as the situation is, as tough as the situation is, if we do it with love, then we stay in alignment with Christ. And that stuck with me just onward my whole career.
Cancer taught Pat two important concepts that have molded her team building and leading throughout her career. First, empathy. Understanding the perspective of others is fundamental to successful relationships. Second, stepping outside of her controlling type A personality and learning to remove fear and intimidation from the workplace. Christ's teachings reinforce Pat's life lessons, and she now leads from authenticity, love, and empathy. Pat now talks to us about how she applies these ideas to the workplace.
When that became available, email, all that other stuff, I'll never forget being in Austria with Glenn. We went to check into a hotel. Oh, Mrs. Asp, we have a fax for you.
I don't want a fax.
The stack of financials, right? It was a turnaround situation, right? And they handed us the things to register. And my husband said, stop, don't register. If you're going to do that, we can be back in Chicago.
Ouch.
No sense being in Austria.
Ouch.
So then we started to negotiate.
Well, I'll take an hour.
Before you wake up in the morning,
Because
I'll take a look.
yeah,
You won't have to see me. And I know I'm not taking anything away from our time together.
right. And
yeah.
Yeah, and you're in Europe, so if you're doing early morning, you're seeing the wrap up from yesterday in America, and you can put out a bunch of to-dos to look at later. Yes, been there, done that. Yeah. So, the type A's listening are going to go, yeah, but how did work suffer if you were going to kind of start making more room for Glenn and family? And how did your leadership style change? And were you as effective?
More effective, number one.
Well, prove it. How so?
Because you had to, when you determine that you're going to have balance, then that means you have to use your work time in a very effective, efficient way. Mm-hmm. It also sends a message to the other leaders, the executives that report to you, that you're human. And that balance is important. I am a self-admitted workaholic. I never expected my people to be. But what their takeaway was, but that's really the way we need to behave.
Because that's what she does.
That's what she does. And so I had to have the conversation with folks like, listen, you've got families, you've got kids and that. And one of my bosses once said, and he was the founder and CEO, what he used to do, he set an alarm in his office. Whatever he had on his desk, he threw it in it. That was when we used to have briefcases, right? He threw it in his
What was that? What was that word? Briefcase?
What the heck is a briefcase? Back in the day. And so he would take everything off and says, scoop it up, put it in the briefcase, close it, and go home to make sure he was there for dinner. And because he traveled a lot. I mean, we were all road warriors. So when he was in town, to him, it was like, that's the ultimate insult to your family, is to be in town and not be home for dinner.
Yeah.
Like, you have an excuse if you're, in another state.
Right.
But what's your excuse when you're in town?
Work is more important.
And we really have to be, as leaders, very intentional and aware, and really hone our empathy skills. Empathetic leadership, especially we saw, even during the whole pandemic time of shutdowns and moving to virtual and that. I think, if we can say one good thing that came is that whole essence of empathetic leadership.
Yeah. And describe that term.
To feel what others are feeling, to put ourselves in their shoes, not in a perfunctory way, but in a truly present way.
And how did your employees respond to that?
I think for us, and it was very interesting. I had my chief operating officer died when he was 44 of adenocarcinoma with an unknown origin. And we as a team lived through that together. You only have about a 25% chance of being alive in 2 years, right? When he was diagnosed. But work gave him purpose. So we all rallied around, and I was with Bob, day before he died,
Mhm.
and been with him, different things. And he had all these options that were gonna go away, that really needed to be exercised.
Mhm.
So Glenn and I, my husband Glenn and I said, listen, we just talked about, we'll exercise for him, we'll upfront the cash, then it can take, it was major money, enough to pay for all the kids' education, pay off the
Mhm.
house, the whole 9 yards.
Mhm.
So I went to meet with Bob, and he was well on his journey.
Yeah.
Well on his journey. And his eyes were inward, they were inward and upward, not external.
Mhm.
And so I explained to him, I said, I need your signature on this in order to do this for Marilyn and the boys, for his wife and the boys. And I said, do you trust me to carry this out,
Mhm.
on your behalf? And he said, Pat, I trust you with my life.
Mhm.
I never would have accomplished what I accomplished. And during the funeral and the eulogy, my colleague, who had the other half of operations, put a message in there for me in his eulogy.
Mhm.
And he said, Pat, there were a lot of fishing trips, golfing trips, and that you let us take over and do, and really didn't get involved.
Mhm.
And he said, I think you thought that was when the relationships were built.
Mhm.
But it was being in the foxhole with you, day in, day out, doing the right thing,
Mhm.
as tough as it may be. And we did it as a team.
Mhm. Yes, that is a wonderful illustration and definition. What strength did God provide for you to draw upon during those times when you started leading in such an empathetic way?
That, I think, what the Lord has allowed me and gifted me during this time was authenticity and transparency. That it was okay
Yeah.
to let people see sadness,
Mhm.
fear, and how to channel disappointment in a way that's not anger,
Mhm.
but that we take the opportunity to teach.
Mhm. Pat, you've talked about medical things where God has grabbed your attention and really impacted your life. You shared a story with me that I think is just so courageous. And I wish I would have heard it when I was 25 years old. But instead of cancer, it was your husband, Glenn, that God
Yes.
used to send this message, and your courageous act afterwards. Tell us about it.
We were traveling together, and which was unusual because I was a road warrior and that.
Yeah.
So we were at an annual meeting for our company, and our spouses came with us flying home.
Mhm.
And we couldn't get, at the time, you had boarding passes and whatever, and seat assignments, all that good stuff. And we went up to the desk, and the gal said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't give you a seat assignment."
Mhm.
And or we're not sure we can put you together.
Mhm.
So I was like, here we are, finally together. We
Right.
get to fly home together.
Mhm.
And the whisper screen came out. Everybody knows what that is. It's where you're not raising your voice, but you're yelling.
Right. Right.
Like, what do you mean we can't have a seat assignment? So anyway, long story short, we had to go off, sit in the waiting area. And my husband, Glenn, looked at me and he said, you know what? I don't like it when you behave like that. And I said, well, of course, you go into denial,
Right.
What do you mean like that? I mean, I didn't raise my voice or anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said, Pat, you would never want anyone to speak to one of your employees the way you just spoke.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the punchline. He said, put the switchblade away.
A brave man.
A brave man. So the next day we had a sales meeting. I had my executive team and they wanted to know how the meeting went. And before we closed, I said, Glenn said something to me yesterday. And I just want your opinion. I mean, I wanted that six people to disagree with him, right?
Right. That was the hope.
That was my intention. But nobody disagreed with them. And they said, Pat, your vision and your goal setting and that is phenomenal. Your intensity on a goal is unmatched and necessary. But that intensity, when it is put upon a person, will blow them away. When you're disappointed, your only reaction is anger. Someone's not reaching a standard. If they're not, you see things that are just wrong. I said, okay, I need a substitute behavior. So when I'm disappointed, I will take time to teach. If you ever see me that it looks like that's not going to be my reaction, stop me. And I made a commitment to that team. And that's been many decades ago.
Yeah.
Many decades ago.
How did the dynamic change?
Pardon?
How did the dynamic change after that conversation? First of all, that you had the conversation is amazing to me, but what changed?
I think as I went out into the field, in particular, when I would be touring hospitals and that, people weren't afraid. And when people aren't afraid, they learn. We've all heard the adage, you're yelling so loud, I can't hear you.
Right.
Or they were like a deer caught in headlights. Well, when they're in that mode, all the blood is going from their brain to their internal organs, right?
Right.
So they're not learning. They're not growing. And so it gave me the opportunity to truly impact people's lives and their performance. And the more calm I could get people to get feedback, the better off everybody was. So my team then knew if I saw something, I said, hey, teachable moment when we get in private, right? And that's what I did. And I didn't have to say a word. When I was touring hospitals, and I had the manager say, you take notes, whatever, and then we'll compare notes at the end. They got 99% of what was wrong. The 1% or whatever, we'd circle back and say, fine, now you know it. What are you going to do to fix it by when and let your boss know?
Right. Yeah. So you left the corporate world, you went into consulting to help engage companies in building culture. Service Master, while you were there, had an extremely Christ-centered culture and God-honoring culture. So talk to me about the transition to your Aspire Consulting group and what you're doing today as kind of the fruition of all those learnings, and what are you in Christ doing today?
Well, the transition was really about taking all my experiences of Six Sigma and the service profit chain, and knowing that you could hardwire culture into business models for sustainability. The culture as I knew it at Service Master, with the first objective to honor God in all we do, was really an objective of inclusion. Why? Because we didn't define God for people. We didn't define God. And you wouldn't see at the corporate level, you wouldn't see that objective any longer on the website, for example. But interestingly, as I've learned over the decades, if you don't have operational definition of what your values mean, everybody's walking around with a different definition.
Right.
For example, servant leadership. You know, I could ask 10 people and I get 10 different definitions.
Right.
You know, teamwork. You know, everybody has a different definition.
Right.
So you need to have operational definitions for your organization, right? So we're all in alignment of what it means. But even then, it's not measurable. And so you really need to get down to the behavioral level. Behaviors transcend all the labels that we use. And behaviors are observable. And behaviors can be hardwired into your business model processes and systems and compensation schemes. And for me in this chapter, if I can help preserve the goodness of companies and organizations that usually discover there may be a vulnerability, either during rapid growth, mergers and acquisitions, or succession planning, if I can help that sustainability, that is what I want to do. That's what Aspire does.
Yeah.
And as far as
go ahead.
As far as Christ is concerned, I am still hell-bent on surrendering. And more each day, Gene, it's just that reminder that I surrender to what it is He has in mind for my day, my week, my month, my business.
Well, Pat, it's been a real joy to listen to your story, and I so identify with you, and I thank you for giving me encouragement that, you know, controlling people can be nice to others and still be successful.
Thank you, Gene. Thank
I
you.
wish Christ would have taught me that earlier, and to share your story, you know, through the times of struggle of health of your family and what that has meant. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gene.
What a beautiful thought from a powerful executive. My goal is continuing to surrender. And it is true. The wisest leaders understand that surrendering to Christ empowers them as effective leaders. Peace.